Hi, we're here with Stacy Schiff, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Cleopatra, and her book The Witches is out October 27th, and we're really excited about it. You've written about Cleopatra and you've written about Vera Nabokov. Why did you choose to focus on a group of women, and why the witches now?
It seemed to me, first of all, it doesn't seem obvious to you that you'd go directly from Cleopatra to 17th century Massachusetts.
Oh, sure.
That seemed really obvious to me. It seemed to me at once a story that is immensely important and fascinating at the same time. There are episodes of history which are significant, and there are episodes of history which are just kind of wacky. And this is, in terms of a wackiness, about as much out of the ballpark as you can get. It's also a very seminal incident in American history. Its repercussions will continue for years. We'll feel its legacy for years, and it's very topical. So the more I looked into it, the more I began to see these modern resonances that made it seem incredibly vital, and also something we should be talking about today.
So why is it so important that people read it today in 2000?
A couple of things come to mind immediately. 1692 is a very anxious moment in American history. The early American is living without a charter. He or she is living under siege in many ways, physically, spiritually, economically, politically. I think we too live in a very dislocated moment, and there's a sense of that anxiety and that searching for reasons and searching for some kind of narrative that I think felt sort of very familiar in terms of what we're experiencing and what was being experienced at the time. There's also something about the contagion factor, especially in a global world. We begin to see that we are all interconnected and that we all tend to adopt the same stories, hear the same stories, begin to tell ourselves the same stories. We're highly suggestible because of other things that come our way. And an internet culture in many ways recapitulates what an oral culture had done in 1692, so that you begin to see misinformation making its very healthy way through the system. So there just seemed to me so many ways in which these people resembled us and maybe didn't look like us, but thought like us, despite the fact that they are 323 years removed from us.
They're just like us, they just don't have Facebook.
They don't have Facebook, and they really had a really bad internet connection too, exactly. And it was really cold and really dark. Yeah.
Well, what's one thing that surprised you in your research that you think readers will really love learning while they read?
Oh God, there were so many things. I mean, I realized how ill-versed I was in the 17th century. I was amazed by how a story comes to be, because you start out here with a couple of girls who are experiencing symptoms which people think is witchcraft, and who accuse 3 women. And before you know it, 9 people are accused. And before you know it, that's grown to 60. And then suddenly it's hundreds of people participating, not just in witchcraft, but in a diabolical, subversive act to overthrow the government. So this whole thing has just kind of snowballed. And that I found utterly fascinating, to see who's taking his cues from whom and how those stories blossom and flourish. I think I was surprised by the political backdrop. There's a huge piece of this which was political. I don't mean to belabor the politics, but there's a sort of dress rehearsal for the American Revolution before 16, 3 years earlier, and it plays a huge role here. And I had no inkling that there had ever been this moment where the colonists essentially overthrow a British governor and say, we'd like to govern ourselves, please leave us alone. And that has a great deal to do with the trials, and it's this surprisingly similar set of images. The imagery is completely constant between the two, the diabolical invasion and what they see as an invasion of redcoats from England. There were so many sort of wacky similarities in that respect.
Well, why were people confessing?
Well, torture is always an effective means. So to some extent, to some extent that explains things. At a certain point in the summer, it is very clear to people who were accused that if they confess, they will not hang. So obviously there's an enormous impetus at that point to confess and to deliver up a story. Earlier on, it's very clear that these men who are in authority, who many of these people have never in their life spent any time with, and who are pressing them for answers in a very small space and under immense pressure and very eloquently, are going to pull things out of them that they feel they're responding to authority, they're giving authority what it wants. And there too, there's a male-female dynamic to some extent. Many of these are women who are standing before the wealthy men from the neighboring town who are running the hearings and who are essentially unable to stand up for what they might think is true. In many cases, male relatives also convince women that they must be witches. So there are some sort of stunning examples of male family members saying to a sister or to a sibling or to a mother, "I know you're a witch."
Well, you know, women are the main characters in the Salem Witch Trials, but you also write that once in court, the women played secondary roles. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, what's interesting is that the girls are the original bewitched, the afflicted girls who are experiencing these symptoms, begin to point fingers. And again, we don't know why they point fingers, where they do, if they came up with the names or if the names were fed to them by the men in whose homes they lived or who were their fathers or their uncles or their ministers. But once everything gets into court, and the people whom these girls have accused show up in court, it's the men who are really running the hearings. And it's the men who are deposing the witnesses and the men who are recording what we have in terms of hearing testimony and the men who are doing the arresting. And at that point, too, men begin to jump into the story. And although few of them experience the symptoms of witchcraft, they are all able to contribute something to this sort of bubbling cauldron of accusations. So one will come up with the bewitched hay, or another will come up with, the dancing rope or the killer cat. They all have a story to tell. And it's often about them being physically attacked by a woman, often when they're at home in bed alone, which is kind of interesting. So there's a real sense there of the men telling the story and taking over the narrative at a certain point, and certainly the men who are prosecuting the entire thing.
So who would have been safe? Like, would we have been safe? Would Beyonce have been safe? Like, what made a person safe?
What's interesting about Salem is typically a witch had been a choleric, foot-stomping, sharp-tongued, stubborn old woman. In 1692, a witch could be almost anyone. There was no immunity, neither gender, nor rank, nor fortune. Nothing really protected you. Often it was someone who was a little bit too wealthy, or a little bit too gifted, or a little bit too smart, someone who was able to think, to guess what question was about to be asked before it was asked, someone who spun suspiciously fine linen or made particularly good cheese. I mean, in any way, anything that set you apart could have made you vulnerable. But it's unclear in many, many cases why some of these people are accused. Anyone who really has a stiff spine will fare poorly. So if you have a stiff spine, you are probably not going to do so well.
You point out that the Puritans were maniacal record keepers, but that there was no trace of a single session of the witchcraft court sessions. What happened is, and you even say that this is the real ghost story that was happening.
It seems it, because it's almost like a conspiracy takes over, where how could this all have happened and we have so little paper on it? We don't really know what happened to the court papers. They disappeared later in the 18th century, probably in a riot, probably during one of the Stamp Act riots, but that's unclear. I don't think anyone wanted them to continue to exist, so it was probably a good riddance moment that they do disappear. But even other things that you'd think would be complete, diaries, will skip 1692, or the church record book was rewritten so that it just somersaults over those weeks. Letters, personal letters, one of the witchcraft judges' correspondence, we have everything except 1692. It's a very eerie thing that those things go missing.
So what's the biggest mystery of the Salem witch trials to you?
There are so many mysteries. I mean, you have to wonder what really afflicted the girls. And we have answers, but I don't know that you will ever have a definitive answer, because no girl ever leaves her own account or any kind of diary. But to me, one of the greatest mysteries is what impels these men to prosecute as effectively and as mercilessly as they do, because that's never happened before. So why now? Why are they? Many people have been accused of witchcraft before in Massachusetts. Massachusetts before 1692 has hung 6 witches, that's it. Why in 1692 does everyone who walk into that court get convicted? What kind of agenda is at work here? And also, how does this crazy story about the subterfuge of the state come into being? Who dictates that wild narrative? It's not clear entirely how to solve those mysteries was really what I set out to do. There's an interesting progression. The trials end very abruptly in the fall, October of 1692, and then no one talks about them. And there's this moment of utter silence. Things go back to normal. People go back to sitting next to people they've accused in church. They go back to living with the kids who accused them at home. They go back to listening to the ministers who have hanged people or helped to hang people, in meeting. So there's this very swift return to normalcy. And there are a few apologies which will come in 1706. But for the most part, it's utter eerie silence. And the trials aren't really resurrected in a way for a couple of generations, as often happens with history, like the French occupation or something that didn't really happen until a few generations after it really happened. And in this case, the trials come back to life, so to speak, during the Civil War era, when the South needs a reason to bludgeon the North. So they begin to say, well, yes, we kept slaves, but you all burned witches. And of course, New England hadn't burned witches, but they begin to use this as a weapon against New England, and that's, in a funny way, what keeps the history alive.
Hey, well, thank you so much. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Lauren.
The book is The Witches, and it comes out October 27th, and you're not going to want to miss it.